The dining room was silent, save for the occasional clink of cutlery against fine china. The birthday cake sat untouched in the center of the table, its candles long since extinguished, smoke trailing like ghosts of wishes already denied. Margaret Holloway, now 50 years old, sat stiffly in her chair, her hands folded in her lap, waiting for someone, anyone, to say something meaningful. Peter, her husband of 26 years, was already back on his phone, thumb scrolling with robotic focus. Across the table, Emily, her only child, now a junior doctor, looked bored, sipping wine like she had somewhere far more important to be. Margaret cleared her throat softly. "I was thinking," she began, her voice gentle but uncertain, "perhaps I could take that painting course at the community studio. I saw a flyer last week. They're offering a beginner's class every Saturday." Peter didn't even glance up. "You mean spend our weekends dabbling in finger painting while the house chores pile up?" Emily chuckled under her breath. "Honestly, Mum, you've never really done anything worth admiring. You looked after me, yes, but what else?" The silence that followed was crushing. Margaret stared at her daughter, blinking slowly. Her lips parted, but no words came. It was as if the air had thickened, pressing against her chest. Her throat tightened. "I see," she managed to say at last, standing up quietly. Peter looked up then, finally, but only to say, "Don't make a scene, Margaret. Not on your birthday. Not on your birthday." As if the day had ever truly been hers. She left the table, her footsteps slow but steady, and climbed the stairs with a strange calm settling over her. In the bedroom, she found her old sketchbook buried beneath scarves and yellowed letters in the wardrobe drawer. She opened it and saw faint pencil outlines, flowers, birds, faces she once imagined into being. She felt something crack. Not in the loud, dramatic way a bone breaks, but in the quiet way frost thaws under sunlight. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Margaret packed a small suitcase. She included only what mattered, a few clothes, her sketchbook, a folder of forgotten ideas, and a single oil painting she had once attempted but never finished. It was of a window, looking out at nothing. She left a note on the kitchen counter. "Don't wait up. I've decided to find the life I missed." Then she walked out of the house, into the cool Shrewsbury night. The wind whispered along the hedgerows. Behind her, everything remained still. But in front of her, the road began. Margaret arrived in Brighton just before dawn, the sky bruised with hues of violet and grey. The train station was nearly empty, save for a few students with backpacks and an old man feeding biscuits to the pigeons. She stepped out into the cool morning air, feeling the salt breeze sweep across her face. It smelled like change, sharp, unfamiliar, but oddly comforting. She had found the room listing online 2 days before her birthday. It was above a small art gallery tucked between a florist and a bookshop on a quiet street near the seafront. She had called in secret and spoken to Fiona, the owner. There had been a warmth in Fiona's voice that Margaret hadn't realized she had been craving. The gallery door bore a faded sign, Fiona Marlowe Fine Arts. Margaret knocked gently, suitcase in hand. After a moment, it creaked open. "You must be Margaret," Fiona said, barefoot and wearing a paint-stained jumper. Her hair was silver, cut short and wild. "Come in, love. The kettle's on." The room above the gallery was small but sunlit, with slanted ceilings and a narrow window that looked straight out to the sea. The bed was made with a patchwork quilt, and an easel stood by the corner, like it had been waiting just for her. "I don't expect perfection," Fiona said as she handed over the keys. "Only honesty. You said you used to paint." "I did," Margaret replied quietly. "Years ago. Then you still can. The studio's downstairs. Open 24 hours for madwomen and geniuses alike." Margaret laughed for the first time in weeks. Later that day, Fiona took her on a tour of the gallery. It wasn't grand, but it was full of soul. The walls bore paintings of abstract cities, stormy coastlines, and haunting portraits with eyes that seemed to follow you. Fiona explained that she believed in giving space to women who had been silenced or forgotten, artists who had been told they were too old, too plain, too busy raising others. "We don't paint for praise," Fiona said. "We paint because we must." Margaret felt something stir deep within her. That night, she set up her canvas by the window. For hours, she stood silently, brush in hand, staring at the blank space. Then, slowly, her hand began to move. She painted the window again, just as she had before, but this time, outside the window, there was a flicker of light. A hint of a path. Something just beginning. But before she could continue, her phone lit up. 7 missed calls. 1 message. From Peter. She opened it, heart pounding. "You've had your fun. Come home. We can talk about this like adults." Margaret stared at the message, her fingers trembling slightly. Then she placed the phone face down, dipped her brush again, and painted over the darkness. The days in Brighton passed with a rhythm Margaret hadn't known she needed. Each morning, the sea whispered through the open window, pulling her from sleep with a gentler touch than any alarm clock ever had. She would make a pot of tea, open her sketchbook, and begin to draw, no pressure, no judgment, just movement. In the gallery below, Fiona flitted about like a storm in boots. She curated exhibits, argued with suppliers, and greeted customers with the grace of a woman who had long since stopped caring what people thought of her. Margaret admired her quietly, watching from the stairs as Fiona transformed chaos into beauty. It was on a rainy Wednesday when Margaret showed Fiona her first completed canvas. A tall, narrow window with light breaking through storm clouds. Fiona studied it in silence, then nodded. "It's honest," she said. "You can always tell when someone's painted with memory." Encouraged, Margaret painted more. 1 canvas became 2, then 4. She painted the quiet ache of her marriage, the loneliness behind Emily's childhood laughter, the years she had swallowed her voice in order to be what others needed. She painted and cried and laughed, sometimes all at once. But then came the letter. It arrived by post, cream-colored and formal. The envelope bore the sharp, impersonal logo of a solicitor's office in Shrewsbury. Margaret hesitated before opening it. Inside, in crisp, cold language, was a letter from Peter's lawyer. He had begun divorce proceedings. He wanted the house. He was claiming financial dependency. He accused her of abandonment without cause. She sat on the edge of her bed, letter in hand, the walls of her little room closing in. Later that evening, Fiona found her downstairs, standing before one of the blank canvases. "Trouble?" Fiona asked, eyes narrowing. "Peter's divorcing me," Margaret replied. "And he's taking everything. He says I left him." "Well, you did. But not like that." Fiona shrugged. "It's always like that when a woman stops being convenient." The next morning, Margaret painted again. Not a window this time, but a fire. Wild, devouring, alive. As if her own silence was finally catching light. Fiona watched from across the room and murmured, "There's no going back now." And Margaret, with eyes still on the canvas, whispered, "Good." Word of Margaret's paintings spread faster than she expected. One evening, a couple from London wandered into the gallery during a storm. The wife, a literary agent, stood frozen before Margaret's third piece, The Silent Chair, a portrait of an empty seat beneath a dim chandelier. She bought it without blinking. Fiona was delighted. "That one painting's going to do more for you than 100 apologies ever could." The following week, Fiona insisted Margaret enter 3 pieces into the Brighton Women in Art showcase. Margaret hesitated, still half believing she didn't belong in that world. But Fiona would not hear it. "You're not some tired housewife brushing daisies on a teacup," she snapped. You're an artist. Act like it. Margaret submitted the silent chair, Storm Beyond the Window, and her newest, Burning Room, a raw, ferocious piece that looked like emotion itself had spilled across the canvas. It was placed center stage in the exhibit. People talked. They whispered. They pointed. But they didn't look away. That night, after the gallery closed and the sea winds howled through the streets, Margaret returned to her room and found a message waiting on her phone. It was from Emily. Mum. I saw your name online. Are you really in Brighton? I didn't know you were serious about painting. Margaret stared at the message, heart-twisting. Emily hadn't called since the birthday dinner. Not once. The next day, Margaret walked along the pier, watching gulls dive between waves. Her phone rang. It was Emily again. This time, she answered. Hello, Mum. Emily's voice was unsure, even brittle. I didn't know how much it meant to you. I just thought you were going through a phase. Margaret said nothing. I didn't mean what I said, about you not doing anything worth admiring. I was tired. Stressed. You know how I get. Margaret stopped at the edge of the railings, the sea crashing beneath her. Emily, she said calmly, when I left, it wasn't to punish you. Or your father. It was to find myself. And I think I've found a piece of me I didn't realize had survived. There was a long silence on the line. I'd like to come see your work, Emily said at last. You can, Margaret replied. But only if you come as someone who wants to know me. The line disconnected. That evening, Margaret returned to the gallery to find Fiona standing still in the center of the room. Her face was pale, her mouth tight. What is it? Margaret asked. Fiona held up her phone. Your husband's given an interview. Some local paper up in Shrewsbury. Says you abandoned your family for some woman's vanity project. He says he's fighting to protect what's his. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. On the wall behind Fiona, Burning Room flickered under the gallery lights like it was alive. The article went viral in Shrewsbury by morning. Margaret's name was suddenly threaded through bitter comments and online gossip. Former neighbors who had never spoken to her were quoted as saying she had always seemed distant, always a little proud. Peter had painted her as a cold woman who had abandoned a loyal husband and a dutiful daughter. He posed in front of their old home for the camera, arms folded, wearing that familiar self-righteous frown. He claimed he had no choice but to speak out. Fiona read the article aloud in the gallery while Margaret stood motionless, eyes fixed on the ocean outside. They're not interested in truth, Fiona muttered. They're interested in spectacle. Margaret felt a hollow ache stir deep in her chest. But it wasn't quite sadness, it was anger, dense and burning. I gave up everything for them, she whispered. I became someone I didn't recognize. And now he calls that loyalty abandonment. You still want to keep quiet? Fiona asked, folding the paper. Margaret didn't answer. Instead, she walked over to her work in progress, an untitled canvas still wet with layers of grey and violet, and, with a firm stroke, dragged red across the center. The paint bled through like a wound. That evening, the gallery hosted a private showing. Writers, collectors, and artists from across Sussex arrived, their shoes damp from the rain, voices loud and confident. Margaret wore a deep navy dress she hadn't touched in years. It clung softly to her, reminding her of a time before house dresses and washing lines. People admired her work with hushed awe. One painting drew them in like moths to flame, Burning Room. A tall man with sharp glasses leaned in. This piece, he said, it's not just art. It's rebellion. Margaret smiled faintly. It's survival. After the crowd thinned, a woman approached her quietly. She was small, with ink-stained fingers and a notebook under one arm. I write for The Independent, she said. I'd like to tell your story. Margaret hesitated. She thought of Peter's voice, Emily's judgment, the whispers from her old town. Then she remembered the quiet ache of empty days. The loneliness of being invisible in her own home. I'll tell it, she said at last, but only in my own words. That night, she returned to her room and wrote for hours. Not just about Peter or Emily, but about who she had been before them. About her art. Her silence. Her awakening. When she finally looked up, the sky outside was breaking into gold. And beneath her fingertips, the story of Margaret Holloway had finally begun to take shape, this time, with her name firmly at the center. But just as she was drifting into sleep, her phone buzzed again. Emily. Dad's coming to Brighton. Tomorrow. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She lay awake in her small attic room, listening to the wind batter the window pane, wondering how it would feel to stand face to face with Peter again, not in their kitchen, not in silence, but here, in the world she had rebuilt without him. By midday, the skies had cleared, though the wind still carried salt and warning. Fiona insisted on staying close, pretending to rearrange canvases in the gallery, but her eyes flickered to the door every few seconds. Just past 1 o'clock, the bell above the entrance jingled. Peter Holloway stepped inside, dressed in his usual greys and navy, every inch the solicitor he always prided himself on being. His eyes scanned the room like a man entering a courtroom. When he spotted Margaret standing beside burning room, his lips twitched into a rehearsed smile. Well, he said, this is quaint. Margaret didn't move. Why are you here, Peter? I'm here because you've turned our private life into a public embarrassment. Your little art tantrum has consequences. Emily's friends are asking questions. My clients are wondering if I've lost control at home. This isn't your home, she replied, her voice steady. He glanced around the gallery with clear distaste. You're selling feelings on a canvas and calling it purpose. You're throwing away everything we built. No, she said firmly. You built a prison, and I cleaned it. Now I've found the key. Peter's smile slipped. You've always been dramatic. Margaret stepped forward, her expression unchanged. I gave up a career. A voice. My passions. All for a man who called it duty and a daughter who saw me as furniture. He flinched. Just slightly. But she saw it. I'm not asking for your understanding anymore, she continued. I don't need your permission, your approval, or your protection. What I need, what I've finally claimed, is myself. Peter looked at her, really looked, for perhaps the first time in years. And something in his eyes shifted. Not regret. Not pain. But fear, the fear of losing control. You've changed, he said quietly. No, Margaret replied. I've returned. The door opened behind them. Emily stepped inside, breathless, hair tousled by the wind. Mum, she stopped short when she saw them both. Peter turned to her, seizing the moment. Tell her, Emily. Tell her how all of this is madness. Tell her we can still go home. Emily looked between them. At her father, so certain. At her mother, so still. And for the first time, her voice trembled. I don't think she wants to come home. Peter's face hardened. He opened his mouth to speak, but Margaret raised a hand. Leave, Peter. He hesitated. But there was nothing more to say. He turned and walked out. And when the bell above the door jingled shut, it sounded like the click of a lock, one that would never open again. After Peter left, the gallery was silent. Emily stood near the doorway, eyes wide, breath shallow, as if she too were waiting for something to collapse. But nothing did. The world stayed whole. Margaret walked to the counter and poured 2 glasses of water. She handed one to Emily, who accepted it with a quiet, thank you. They sat together on the worn leather bench near the back of the gallery, surrounded by paintings that knew more of Margaret than her daughter ever had. "I thought I knew who you were," Emily said at last, voice barely audible over the hum of the sea wind. "But I never asked." Margaret took a slow sip before replying. "I didn't offer much, either. I was always too busy trying to be what I thought a mother should be." Emily looked down at her hands. "You were always there. But it felt like you weren't, you." "I wasn't," Margaret admitted. "I disappeared somewhere between the laundry, the school run, and waiting up for your father to come home. I told myself it was noble. But it wasn't. It was erasure." They sat in silence for a while. Not awkward, not strained. Just real. "You know," Emily murmured, "I always admired you. I just didn't know how to say it. I thought admiration meant ambition. Degrees. Promotions. But this," she gestured at the walls around them. "This is brave." Margaret smiled, eyes damp. "It's not too late, Emily. Not for either of us." That weekend, Margaret's story was published in The Independent. It wasn't sensational. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply honest. People wrote letters to the gallery, strangers who had walked similar paths. Women who had lost themselves and found their way back through clay, music, movement, light. One letter came from a woman in Devon who wrote, "You made me believe I'm not just a mother. I'm still me." Fiona framed that letter and hung it near the staircase. One morning, a month later, Emily arrived at the gallery holding a small portfolio. "I brought something," she said shyly. "From my final year at school. It's terrible, probably. But it's mine." Margaret opened the folder to find charcoal sketches of faces, intense, emotional, painfully human. "They're raw," she said, genuinely moved. "And real." "I don't know if I want to be a doctor forever," Emily whispered. "But I don't want to waste years pretending either." Margaret reached out and took her hand. "Then don't. Begin again. There's no shame in starting late. Only in never starting." Later that day, they painted side by side for the first time, two women at different ends of rediscovery, surrounded by the sea and the sound of brushes finding their rhythm. But as the sun set over Brighton's rooftops, Fiona burst through the door, waving a crisp envelope. "It's from the Royal Society of Women Artists," she announced, breathless. "Margaret. They want your work in their winter showcase." Margaret stood still, paintbrush in hand. Not invisible. Not forgotten. Chosen. The winter showcase was held in London, beneath the vaulted ceilings of an old stone hall just off Trafalgar Square. Soft lighting bathed the space in gold, reflecting off frames, sculptures, and silent eyes on canvas. Margaret stood near the entrance, wrapped in a long charcoal coat, her fingers nervously twined around each other. Her work hung at the center of the gallery, Return to Self, a portrait of a woman standing before a cracked mirror, her reflection no longer broken, but whole. People passed by slowly, drawn to it like moths to a quiet, steady flame. Some studied the brushstrokes, some just stared. One woman wiped a tear from her cheek and walked away without a word. Emily stood beside her mother, not as a daughter dragged along, but as someone proud to be known. She was dressed simply, hair tucked behind her ear, holding Margaret's hand without needing to speak. Fiona arrived late, of course, scarf flying behind her like a banner. "You've caused a stir," she whispered with a grin. "They're calling it the soul of the showcase." Margaret laughed softly, though her eyes shone. "I'm still not sure I believe it." "You don't have to," Fiona said. "But believe in yourself." As the evening went on, a curator approached Margaret with a proposal, a solo exhibit. "Your work speaks for women who've been silenced," he said. "It's not just art, it's liberation." Margaret nodded slowly, overwhelmed but steady. For the first time in her life, people were listening, and not because she had shouted, but because she had spoken in her own way. Later, as the guests thinned and the chill of the city crept back in, Margaret walked alone out onto the steps of the hall. Snow had begun to fall, soft and silent, blanketing the world in white. She looked out over London, alive, bright, waiting. Behind her, the echo of her past had finally faded. And ahead, the world was wide. She inhaled deeply, the cold biting but clean. "I'm ready," she whispered. Then, with a quiet smile, Margaret Holloway stepped out of the shadows.